A lonely widow saved an injured dove, never knowing it would bring her soulmate back to life. Margaret Collins stood motionless at her kitchen window, watching raindrops trace familiar paths down the glass. 67 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, she'd developed a routine in the 3 years since Robert's passing. Coffee at 6, gardening until the arthritis in her hands complained too loudly, then silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Robert had restored for their 30th anniversary. The small cottage that had once vibrated with laughter now stood quiet on the outskirts of Millfield, its rooms filled with memories that Margaret both cherished and avoided. Their daughter, Eliza, called twice weekly from Seattle, her voice a momentary warmth that faded quickly after they hung up. Neighbors occasionally dropped by with casseroles and concern in their eyes, but Margaret had grown skilled at polite dismissals. "Just fine, thank you," she would say, her smile never quite reaching the deep blue eyes that Robert had once claimed held the entire ocean. Just taking each day as it comes. But she wasn't fine. The truth lay in the untouched piano where she'd once played while Robert sang off-key. It lived in the garden that was now meticulously maintained, rather than the joyful tangle they'd cultivated together. It echoed in her habit of cooking for two, then wrapping half for a freezer already full of single-portion meals she couldn't bring herself to throw away. That October morning, as rain transformed her garden into a watercolor painting, Margaret spotted it. A small gray form huddled beneath the bird feeder, trembling in the downpour. At first, she thought it might be a clump of wet leaves. Then it moved. "Oh," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. The dove's wing extended at an unnatural angle, its gray feathers matted with rain and what looked like blood. Something inside Margaret stirred, a feeling almost forgotten. Before she could second-guess herself, she was at the door, slipping her feet into rubber gardening boots and grabbing an old kitchen towel. The rain immediately plastered her thin sweater to her shoulders, but she barely noticed as she crossed the yard. The dove watched her approach with one bright eye, not attempting to flee. Up close, Margaret could see its chest rising and falling rapidly. "You poor thing," she murmured, kneeling in the mud. Her knees protested, but she ignored them. "Let's get you inside." To her surprise, the bird allowed her to gently wrap it in the towel. A soft coo escaped it as she lifted the small bundle, feeling the rapid heartbeat against her palm. The sensation, life pulsing against her skin, sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. Inside, Margaret cleared a space on her kitchen counter, laying down fresh dish towels. She placed the dove there with trembling hands, suddenly uncertain. Robert had been the one who handled injured creatures that occasionally found their way to their garden. A rabbit with a thorn in its paw, baby birds fallen from nests. He'd been a veterinarian, his hands always knowing exactly what to do. Her hands were just hands, empty ones. "I don't know what I'm doing," she told the dove, which regarded her with an unnerving steadiness. "But we'll figure it out together." She found an old shoebox, lined it with a soft hand towel, and placed it near the radiator in the living room. After a quick internet search on her aging laptop, she prepared a mixture of water with a pinch of salt and sugar, which she offered to the dove using an eyedropper from Robert's old medicine cabinet. The bird accepted a few drops, its eyes never leaving her face. "You have somewhere to be?" Margaret asked, attempting humor that fell flat in the empty room. "Someone waiting for you?" The dove cooed softly, and Margaret felt foolish for the tears that suddenly blurred her vision. She blinked them away, focusing on examining the wing. It didn't appear broken, just badly sprained, with a small cut that had mostly stopped bleeding. "We can handle this," she said more confidently, cleaning the wound with gentle dabs of diluted antiseptic. "You rest and I'll make us some tea." That night, Margaret slept on the sofa instead of the bedroom she still couldn't bear to occupy alone, checking on the dove every few hours. By morning, it seemed more alert, accepting water and small bits of birdseed from her palm. "You need a name," she told it as weak sunlight filtered through the curtains. The dove tilted its head, its eye catching the light in a way that reminded her powerfully of something. Someone. "How about Gray?" The bird cooed and Margaret smiled. A real smile, small but genuine, the first in months. Over the next few days, a strange transformation began in the cottage on Willow Lane. Rooms that had been preserved like mausoleums were opened, aired out. The radio, silent for years, now played softly in the background. Margaret found herself humming as she prepared meals, speaking aloud to Gray, who watched from his box, occasionally permitted to hop around the coffee table under her supervision. "Robert would have known exactly how to splint your wing," she told Gray on the fourth day, as she changed his bedding. "He had magic hands. Everyone said so. Animals would calm immediately when he touched them." Gray cooed, hopping closer to her hand. "He had this ridiculous habit of naming all the animals he treated," she continued, suddenly wanting to speak of Robert rather than around him, as she'd done for 3 years. There was a 3-legged cat he called Tripod. An actual tripod! His patient's owners thought it was charming. The dove listened, tilting its head as if absorbing every word. By the end of the week, Gray was standing more confidently, his wing held closer to his body. Margaret found herself checking her laptop frequently, reading about dove recovery, rehabilitation, and, though she tried not to think about it, release. "You'll want to get back to your life?" she told him one evening, as rain once again tapped against the windows. "I understand that." Gray nudged her finger with his beak, a gesture that had become familiar. Something about the bird's presence had cracked open a door inside Margaret, allowing memories of Robert to flow through without the accompanying tidal wave of grief. She found herself telling Gray stories about their honeymoon in Vermont, where it rained for 5 days straight and they'd played board games in a cabin, about the time Robert had delivered twin foals at 3 in the morning and came home covered in substances she refused to identify, about the garden they'd planted together, each anniversary adding a new perennial. "He loved doves, you know," she said, stroking Gray's now smooth feathers. "Said they were loyal to a fault. They mate for life, he told me, just like us." That night, Margaret dreamed of Robert for the first time without waking in tears. In the dream, he stood in their garden, sunlight filtering through the maple trees, his hands extended toward her. "Keep your heart open, Maggie," he said, using the nickname only he had ever used. "The world still has gifts for you." She woke with a curious lightness in her chest and the sense that something important was about to happen. That afternoon, Margaret was at the sink washing dishes when movement in the garden caught her eye. A man stood at her gate, tall and slightly stooped, looking up at her cottage with an expression she couldn't decipher from a distance. Her first instinct was wariness. She rarely received visitors and never unannounced ones. She dried her hands on a dish towel and moved to the window for a better look. The man was older, perhaps in his 70s, with a head of silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, triggered a distant recognition. When he opened the gate and started up the path, Margaret found herself moving to the door before she could question why. She opened it just as he reached the steps. "Margaret Collins?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "Yes," she replied, one hand still on the doorknob, ready to close it if necessary. "I'm Thomas Gray." He removed his hat, revealing more fully a face lined by time and weather. "I believe you may have found something that belongs to me." Margaret blinked, the name striking her like a physical touch. "Gray?" The man nodded, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "My homing dove. She's been missing for over a week. Someone in town mentioned seeing an injured bird in this direction, and I've been asking around." He paused, studying her face. "I'm sorry to disturb you." "No, it's—" Margaret stepped back, gesturing inside. "Please, come in. I do have a dove. I've been calling him her Gray, actually." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a coincidence." "Yes," Margaret agreed, leading him into the living room where the dove immediately began cooing excitedly at the sight of Thomas. "Though I'm beginning to wonder if coincidences are what we call things we don't understand yet." Thomas knelt beside the box, murmuring softly to the bird who hopped toward him with obvious recognition. "She's looking much better than I feared," he said, gently examining the wing. "You've taken excellent care of her." "I did my best," Margaret said, suddenly aware of how empty the room would feel when Gray was gone. "My husband was a veterinarian. I remembered some of what he would do." Thomas looked up, his eyes, a startling shade of hazel that shifted between green and gold, meeting hers. He passed 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and the simple words carried a weight of understanding that told Margaret he knew what that loss meant. "My wife has been gone 5 years now." Something passed between them then, a current of shared experience that needed no elaboration. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret heard herself ask. "I was just about to make some." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I'd like that very much." Over tea, Margaret learned that Thomas Gray was a retired literature professor who had taken up dove breeding after his wife's passing. Isabel loved birds, he explained, watching as his dove hopped between them on the coffee table. She always said they were messengers between worlds. Robert, my husband, he loved animals of all kinds. He would have enjoyed your doves. And what did you love, Margaret Collins? Thomas asked, his direct gaze both gentle and penetrating. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her passions in so long. She'd become defined by her widowhood, by what she had lost rather than what she contained. Music? She answered finally. I taught piano for 30 years. And gardening, though I'm afraid my garden has become more of a chore than a joy lately. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Loss has a way of transforming joys into obligations. The things that once gave us pleasure become reminders of what's missing. Yes, Margaret whispered, surprised by how precisely he had articulated her experience. Exactly that. They talked until the shadows lengthened across the living room floor. Thomas spoke of his life in academia, his move to Millfield 5 years ago after Isabel's death, and his gradual return to living through the care of his doves. Margaret found herself sharing stories of Robert, of their life together, and, to her surprise, of the emptiness that had followed. Will you take Gray today? She asked finally, as the conversation reached a natural pause. Thomas glanced at the dove, now dozing contentedly on a cushion. Actually, if you don't mind, I think she could use another day or two of rest before the journey home. My cottage is on the other side of town. Margaret felt a surge of relief. Of course. She's welcome to stay as long as needed. As Thomas prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. I walk in Harrow Park most mornings, he said. There's a bench by the duck pond where I like to read. If you ever find yourself there. The invitation hung in the air between them, undemanding yet full of possibility. I haven't been to the park in years, Margaret admitted, but perhaps it's time to change that. After Thomas left, the cottage felt different. Not empty, but expectant, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. Margaret sat beside Gray, who opened one eye to regard her. He seems nice, your person, she told the bird, though I suppose I'll miss our conversations. That night, Margaret dreamed of Robert again. They walked together through their garden, vibrant with flowers neither of them had planted. You're doing well, Maggie, Dream Robert said, his smile as warm as she remembered. I'm trying, she answered. I miss you every day. I know. He stopped beneath the old maple tree, taking both her hands in his. But missing me doesn't mean you have to miss everything else life has to offer. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but they weren't the desolate tears she'd grown accustomed to. These felt cleansing like spring rain. The next morning, Margaret found herself opening the hallway closet where her coat had hung untouched since last winter. Beside it was Robert's old jacket, the one he'd worn for gardening and walks to the park. Without analyzing the impulse, she reached out and touched it, allowing herself to remember him wearing it rather than avoiding the memory. I'm going to the park, she told Gray, who watched her from his box with what she could have sworn was approval. Just for a little while. Harrow Park was a 10-minute walk from her cottage, a distance that had once seemed negligible but now felt momentous. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and Margaret found herself inhaling deeply, noticing these details as if experiencing them for the first time. The park was quiet on a weekday morning, populated mainly by mothers with strollers and elderly people walking dogs or sitting on benches. Margaret followed the path that wound around the duck pond, her heart inexplicably picking up pace as she approached the far side. She saw him before he noticed her, Thomas Gray sitting on a weathered wooden bench, a book open in his hands, his profile outlined against the backdrop of autumn foliage. Something about the scene felt familiar, as if she had witnessed it before in a dream or another life. When he looked up and saw her, his face brightened with a smile that created a corresponding warmth in Margaret's chest. I was hoping you might come, he said, closing his book and shifting to make room for her. Gray seemed to think it was a good idea, Margaret replied, surprising herself with the touch of humor in her voice. Thomas laughed, the sound rich and genuine. She's a very wise bird, nearly as wise as her namesake. He held up his book, a collection of poems by Thomas Gray, the 18th century poet. You named your dove after yourself? Margaret asked, settling beside him on the bench. Isabel did, actually. She had a peculiar sense of humor. Said it was fitting for a literature professor to have a namesake who could deliver messages. Their conversation flowed with unexpected ease as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Thomas shared his favorite passages from the poetry he was reading. Margaret spoke of the music she had once loved to play. They discovered a shared fondness for old films, quiet mornings, and the particular satisfaction of a perfect cup of tea. When Thomas asked if she would join him for lunch at the small cafe across from the park, Margaret hesitated only briefly before accepting. It wasn't a date, she told herself. Just two people who had experienced similar losses finding comfort in conversation. Yet as they walked side by side along the leaf-strewn path, Margaret felt something shift inside her, like a door long rusted shut beginning to creak open. Over the next 2 weeks, a new rhythm developed in Margaret's life. Mornings in the park with Thomas, afternoons tending to Gray, who was improving rapidly, evenings filled with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. They exchanged stories, shared meals, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls Margaret had built around her heart began to soften. "You're different," Eliza said during their weekly phone call. "You sound, I don't know, more present." "Do I?" Margaret replied, glancing at Gray, who was now able to fly short distances around the living room. "I suppose I feel more present." She told her daughter about the injured dove but found herself hesitating to mention Thomas. The connection felt too new, too fragile to expose to scrutiny or expectations, even well-meaning ones. On a Saturday morning in late October, Thomas arrived at her cottage with a small basket containing fresh bread and homemade jam. "I thought we might have breakfast in your garden," he suggested. "If you'd like." Margaret led him through the house to the back door, suddenly seeing her garden through his eyes, the neat but joyless rows, the absence of the wild profusion she and Robert had once cultivated. "It's not what it used to be," she admitted as they settled at the small iron table. "Robert and I used to plant things randomly, wherever we felt they belonged. It drove our neighbors mad but made us happy." Thomas looked around thoughtfully. "Perhaps it could be that way again." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, though she wasn't sure if she meant the garden or herself. After they ate, Thomas helped her clear away the remnants of a struggling rosebush that hadn't bloomed in years. Their hands occasionally brushed as they worked side by side, each contact sending a small shock through Margaret's system, not unpleasant, but startling in its intensity. "Tell me about him," Thomas said quietly as they sat resting in the afternoon sun, dirt under their fingernails and sweat dampening their brows. "You're Robert." No one had asked Margaret to speak of Robert in this way before, not as a tragedy that had happened to her, but as a person she had loved, complex and real. The invitation opened something in her chest. "He was stubborn," she began, the words coming more easily than she expected. "Incredibly stubborn. And kind in a way that sometimes got him into trouble. He could never say no to anyone who needed help, whether it was a stray animal or a neighbor needing a ride at 3 a.m. As she spoke, Robert seemed to come alive between them, not as a ghost or a weight of grief, but as the man he had been, with virtues and flaws and all the complicated beauty of a fully lived life. "He sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Thomas said when she finally fell silent. "I think you would have," Margaret replied, surprised to find that the thought brought comfort rather than pain. "What about Isabel?" Thomas's eyes softened. "She was fierce, brilliant and opinionated and absolutely certain about everything." He laughed softly. "We argued constantly for 40 years and never once went to bed angry. She could win any debate but always made sure I felt like I'd won something too." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the newly cleared garden bed. "Would you play something for me?" Thomas asked suddenly. "On the piano, if it wouldn't be too difficult." Margaret's heart stuttered. "I haven't played in—" "I know," he said gently, "but I'd very much like to hear you." Inside, Margaret's fingers hovered over the keys of the baby grand that dominated one corner of the living room. Dust had gathered in the crevices despite her regular cleaning of its surface. Gray watched from her perch near the window, head tilted in apparent interest. "I might be terrible," Margaret warned. Thomas settled into the armchair across the room. "I have remarkably forgiving ears." She began with a simple Bach prelude, her fingers stiff and uncertain at first. Notes that had once flowed effortlessly now required concentration. But gradually, as she continued, muscle memory awakened. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had forgotten, the joy of creation, the conversation between musician and instrument. When she finished, she realized Thomas was watching her with an expression of such tender appreciation that it made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said simply. That evening, after Thomas had gone home, Margaret sat with Gray in the growing darkness. "He's leaving tomorrow," she told the dove. "And you'll be going with him. Your wing is nearly healed." Gray cooed softly, hopping closer to Margaret's hand. "It's been good having you here," she continued, gently stroking the bird's feathers. "You've been a messenger, I suppose. Though I'm not entirely sure of the message." She slept deeply that night and dreamed of Robert one last time. In the dream, they stood in their garden as it had been years ago, wild and beautiful, bursting with color and life. "You've found your way back, Maggie," Robert said, his smile gentle. "Not back," she replied. "Forward, I think." He nodded, touching her cheek with familiar tenderness. "That's even better." When Margaret awoke, sunlight was streaming through her curtains, and she felt a curious lightness, as if something heavy had been gently lifted from her shoulders during the night. She made coffee and carried it to the garden, sitting in the morning stillness. From inside, she could hear Gray cooing as if in conversation with the new day. Thomas arrived just after 10, carrying a small wicker cage for transporting Gray home. Margaret felt a pang at the sight of it, knowing it meant their daily visits would come to a natural end. "She's ready," Margaret said, leading him inside where Gray immediately perked up at the sight of Thomas. Her flight is still a bit wobbly, but getting stronger each day. Thomas knelt beside the box that had been Gray's home for nearly 3 weeks. "You've done a remarkable job with her," he said, gently lifting the dove to examine her wing one final time. "Better than any professional could have done." "I had good motivation," Margaret replied. "She's been important to me." Their eyes met over the bird's head, and Margaret felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Margaret," Thomas began, then hesitated. "These past weeks have been—" He was interrupted by a sudden flurry of movement as Gray escaped his gentle hold, flying across the room to land on the piano. Both of them watched in surprise as the dove hopped along the keys, producing a discordant but somehow deliberate series of notes. "Well," Thomas said with a small laugh, "it seems she has something to say." Margaret moved to the piano, reaching for Gray, who allowed herself to be picked up without resistance. As Margaret's fingers brushed the keys, something caught her eye, a small envelope wedged between the music stand and the piano's body, yellowed with age. "What's this?" she murmured, pulling it free. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Maggie, when you're ready." Her hands trembled as she recognized Robert's handwriting. How long had it been there, waiting for her to return to the piano? 3 years? Longer? "Would you like me to give you a moment?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "No, please stay." She wasn't sure why, but having him witness this felt right somehow. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in Robert's familiar, messy scrawl. "My dearest Maggie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to music, which means you're finding your way back to yourself. I don't know when that will be. A month after I'm gone, a year, 5 years, but I knew this day would come because I know you." Margaret's vision blurred with tears, but she continued reading. "I want you to know that loving you has been the great privilege of my life. Every moment, even the difficult ones, has been a gift. But love isn't meant to end when one life does. It's meant to keep growing, changing, finding new expressions." She took a shuddering breath, feeling Thomas's steady presence across the room. "So here is my final request, my love. Don't use what we had as a reason to close yourself off from what might still be. Your heart is too beautiful, too capable of joy to be kept in the dark. When the time comes, when someone or something awakens that spark in you again, embrace it with the same courage you've shown throughout your life." Margaret looked up, meeting Thomas's concerned gaze through her tears. "The letter," she explained, her voice unsteady. "It's from Robert." Thomas nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. He remained where he was, offering silent support without intrusion. She returned to the letter, reading the final paragraph. "Whatever shape your life takes after I'm gone, know that I am cheering you on from whatever comes next. Every moment of joy you experience, every connection you make, every garden you plant or song you play, these are not betrayals of what we had, but honoring of it. Be happy, Maggie. That's all I've ever wanted for you. All my love forever, Robert." The letter trembled in her hands as a lifetime of emotions crashed through her, grief and love and gratitude so intense they could not be contained. She pressed the paper to her chest, feeling as if Robert himself had reached across the divide to release her from a promise she had never made but had kept nonetheless. When she could finally speak, she looked up at Thomas, who waited patiently, his eyes full of compassion. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow he knew I would need permission." Thomas moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "He sounds like a remarkable man who loved you very deeply." "He was," Margaret agreed, carefully folding the letter and returning it to its envelope. She glanced at Gray, who had settled contentedly on the piano. I think he may have sent me a messenger." Thomas's expression softened with understanding. "Isabel always believed there were connections we couldn't see with our eyes alone. I've come to think she might have been right." Margaret reached out, taking his hand in a gesture that felt both monumental and completely natural. "Would you like to stay for lunch? I thought we might eat in the garden and discuss what to plant there in the spring." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "I'd like that very much." That afternoon, as they sat in the autumn sunshine planning a garden neither of them had anticipated sharing, Gray flew in graceful circles above them before landing on the table between them. Her wing, once injured, now supported her perfectly as she hopped from Margaret to Thomas and back again. "I think," Margaret said, watching the dove's contented movements, "that some messengers aren't meant to be sent away once they've delivered their message." Thomas's smile held all the promise of seasons yet to come. "I think you may be right." In the cottage on Willow Lane, a piano that had been silent for years now filled the rooms with music several times a week. The garden, once meticulously maintained, was gradually returning to its former wild glory, with new plantings joining old favorites in an arrangement that honored the past while embracing the future. And if the neighbors sometimes noticed an elderly couple walking hand in hand through Harrow Park, followed by a gray dove that seemed to watch over them with unusual attentiveness, they simply smiled at the reminder that life's most profound transformations often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that love, in all its forms, has a way of circling back to those who keep their hearts open to its return.